NetSparker, the developers of a comprehensive automated web security platform that includes web vulnerability scanning, assessment, and management. NetSparker's desktop and cloud-based security solutions employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities and provides a proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/NetSparker. Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. Welcome back to Paul Security Weekly. Make sure you visit securityweekly.com/webcast. Lots of fun things coming up. Todd Beardsley of Rapid7 will be on to discuss the findings from the National Internet Cloud Exposure Report on August 13th. Also, how to create and run a conference from the geniuses behind the Layer 8 and Wild West Hack and Fest conferences on August 19th. Our next technical training is on August 27th. We'll teach you about Boothole, SIG-RED, and SMB Bleed, best practices to prioritize and remediate vulnerabilities. SecurityWeekly.com/on-demand will get you the archive. Join our mailing list for webcast virtual training announcements, invites to our Discord server, and all things Security Weekly at securityweekly.com/subscribe. We are now going to discuss the security news. Where does everyone want to start? This evening?
Can I start with
at the beginning?
Many good things.
I read this article today, and I didn't believe it at first because I was like, wait, that's not the anniversary. But supposedly, 29 years ago today, the first web page went live, and thus web application hacking started.
It's true. There's a screenshot of the page, too.
Yeah,
it's really
that
chunky.
would be 1991.
92? This says 92. Well, the screenshot of the page says what's new in 92.
Well, yeah. But 29 from 2020 is 1991?
It was 91. August 6th of 1991 is when the page went live.
The internet by then?
Well, so if you go look up, when was the World Wide Web invented? It's like March something... a couple years earlier, right? But this is supposedly the first web page that was available on the World Wide Web.
Awesome.
It's really kind of anticlimactic, actually.
Well, to me, the more important date is when the first publicly available web browser became available, which was called...
Mosaic?
CSA Mosaic.
Mosaic. And I have a slide in one of my presentations because it was something 1993. So the browser, there was web pages out there, but I guess all you had was NCSA before they went public to look at it.
It's kind of like having a car with manual transmission and no clutch.
Yes, exactly right. That's exactly right.
Some inside humor of coming back from Vegas in one of our previous trips.
I just remember taking that first Mosaic browser and pointing it at NetNews. And I remember all the work you used to have to do to look at a picture in NetNews, where you had to download all the UU encoded pieces, pass them back together again, and then a viewer. And then
at this point, Lee, is that vintage porn? Is that?
It is totally.
It didn't even require
alt.porn.sexy,
Well, I mean, that leads us into the lovely Twitter hack teens court date Zoom bombed with porn.
No way.
No, seriously. It's a freaking awesome article. So they go to arraign the guy on the Twitter hacker stuff, and they get Zoom bombed. And they're getting Zoom bombed, and the judge decides, hey, we're going to suspend the hearing.
Yeah.
Right? They take it down. Then they come back up and they get barraged again. And one of the Zoom bombs is actually playing porn from the guy's device. And so they shut it off. So they haven't heard about all the new Zoom improvements, which includes a password or to lock your meeting at the end of the day. It's just a great article.
So the other night at dinner, I met a couple, and she's a family law attorney, and she was telling me about doing Zoom-based trials. And she said the biggest problem that she's facing, you can't kick your client under your table to tell them to shut up.
Yeah.
Yep.
But oh man,
Yep.
Well, make a feature request.
Right. So Ryan Hughes said the judge, Christopher Nash, had remarked that next time he'll require a password. No shit.
You think?
Good Lord.
And this is a 17-year-old that's being arraigned at a hearing, and porn is being Zoom bombed into the Zoom meeting. I just found this hilarious. Sorry, I had to edit
you're
in.
concerned that he's a minor? What?
BBC.com is just a phenomenal reporting. They state Zoom meetings without a password can be joined by anyone with a meeting's ID number.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks
No shit.
for that. Like,
Yeah.
even those of us outside of technology that have done any kind of distance learning, like, they are now also aware of that.
Well,
Thank you,
or
Captain Obvious.
literally everybody in the world, since we're all working remotely now.
Right?
Uh-huh.
But it's interesting how we not just prevent against these attacks, but how do you deal with that, right? Because, like, I have family members that are teachers, and he's like, one of the students mooned the whole classroom or whatever, right? Like, that kind of virtual meetings outside of physical presence, people seem to think that, all the rules of social norm have completely gone out the window, as we've seen since the beginnings of the internet, right? And all of that. And it's interesting how we deal with that and detect these, find the people who are doing them, and maybe bring back some of those social norms.
Here's my tip. Stay in gallery mode so you don't see the full screen of the moonshot. You just see it in a little.
Just see the icon.
It's just a little moon.
Just a small.
That's maybe a deterrent, but all I have to do is tweak it so they're talking all the time, and it'll be the only one being displayed.
Right.
I don't think they'd be talking so much, Jeff, as they. Never mind.
Larry,
Well,
that's no moon.
A sound.
That's no moon.
No moon. No moon.
That's a fully operational battle station.
What's its nickname? Turd Cutter?
All hands on deck.
Oh my!
It took us a little while, but we went down.
Oh, we went down quickly. I went
did.
from a first, like an anniversary, straight into porn. I mean, come on, we're done.
Matthew
So where do we
really
go from
embodied the
here?
spirit of this show. Poor Chad.
So
Is
did-
Chad still
so
there?
did
Chad, you stuck around for this, right?
Oh yeah, I'm still here. I was actually surprised to find out the first webpage wasn't porn.
Right?
I figured that was the whole purpose of the internet with the way things are now.
I think it was the second
Yeah,
page.
that's-
It might have been the second page.
Internet is for
Porn
porn.
pretty much funded the internet. Yep.
Yeah.
Hey,
exactly.
did you all hear about Intel? My story number 4.
But to hear a whole lot of it.
The leaks.
Yeah.
Jeff, tell us.
Tell us, Jeff.
I was waiting for you to find.
None
the
of us have
article.
read the article.
So somebody dumped 20 gigabytes of chip data stolen from Intel.
Interesting.
And this just came out this afternoon. I thought it was interesting because we were just talking to John, pronounce his name for me.
Lucades, yep.
Last night on ESW about problems with hardware and firmware. And at least in the Discord server, we were reckoning back to this is like Spectre and Meltdown. And what we were talking about a little bit last night, not to recap the whole thing, was at least from a compliance regulatory standard perspective, there's not a whole lot of emphasis or focus on hardware and firmware, and not a lot of products and technology that are focused on that. Most everybody's looking at the operating system and applications and databases and things like that. So I thought it was timely that Intel's got some issues.
Well, they do now. Well,
They do now.
Well, I mean, they did before. I mean, aspects of what we covered last night with the bootloader and the secure boot process has some issues.
but just because it's out there doesn't mean there's any much more likely. I mean, I guess if it isn't out there and then it is, there is a higher degree of probability that someone will find vulnerabilities in it. But also, you got to remember when we talked about boot hole, right? That was a vulnerability in one of the vulnerabilities was in Grub, which has been open source since day one, and that's been publicly available out there. It's just, want us to go look at you may want to go look at it, but who wants to really go start actively participating in doing that stuff? It's hard. It's not. You really have to have
that bears
right?
out my whole opinion on the whole concept that everybody was fighting open source. For years and years and years, saying, "Oh, everybody can review the code." Well, that's BS. Everybody doesn't
they're right.
have
Everybody
the ability to review the code.
Yeah,
Or
but
the
nobody's
Joff,
doing it.
Everybody can review the code. The problem is that no one does.
But everybody uses it, Larry.
Right, everyone
I know,
uses
I
it,
know.
but you have to want to, right? In Java, you and I have talked about this, right? Like, looking at the code for a bootloader requires anyone can look at it, but to like understand it at a level where you can point out flaws are two totally different things.
Yeah, it's different skill
Inside of
set,
it. Different skill set. You have to have spent the time to learn that process, maybe looked at other bootloaders. I'm sure the code, I haven't looked at it, but the code inside Grub have to be extremely complex. And I've looked at the configuration and code for bootloaders on IoT devices. Somewhat a lot easier, right? Because it's much more condensed down and a lot less features, right? When you get into Intel, in Grub, there's a lot more stuff there.
Intel's bigger problem is
my favorite sentence in the article, by the way, on the Intel breach, is that some of the passwords on the PDF documents were Intel 123.
Intel's bigger problems, though, are they lost the Apple contract, so they're going to lose all the MacBooks going forward.
So I have a philosophical question that I wanted to ask last night, and I held off, but I'll ask my esteemed colleagues here tonight. Where I came from in the DoD, and where we built things that had stuff like firmware in it. That firmware was a little black box inside of a system, let's say, that was extremely, extremely resistant to any kind of external interaction, shall we say. So, we were talking about firmware last night and, reflashing firmware and updating this, that, and the other. And the thought occurred to me, it's like, if you can remotely upgrade your firmware, is it really firmware, or do we need to come up with some new terminology for it?
I'm not. I think
that's
that's
an interesting
somewhat
point.
semantics, right? Yes, you could put it on
I've always thought that about microcode when it first came about in CPUs as well. The same kind of concept, because it used to be that the instruction set was hard coded onto the chip.
On the ROM, right? That's what we, you'd study that and you'd learn about that there's ROM that's always read-only. And basically, if there's no interface to update it and it truly is read-only in the hardware, you got to replace the hardware to get any kind of updates, right?
So it kind of replaced that whole idea that in a lot of our heads, growing up in computer science and having our education, we were always of the mindset that, the assembly instruction set is the lowest level you can get to. But that's not true. With today's modern processors, you can get to microcode level, which is one level below that, which is programmable to introduce new instructions into central processing units. And this is the same concept that Jeff is alluding to, is when you can update something that formerly used to be just hardware and unchangeable, then is the terminology wrong? Firmware. How firm is it?
Right.
Well, but the other thing is, at some point, if you were to develop any kind of software, can you say you're truly done? And this code is perfect and will never need to be updated. I don't know that there's very many programmers that would ever be so bold as to make that claim. I certainly would never make that claim. I push out a lot of releases every day to improve the software.
I knew a few.
True story.
But it's a different time and a different generation where the firmware was embedded modules, really. It might be semantics of the terminology, but when I hear firmware, I hearken back to one of my early assignments where I was looking into doing some sort of crypto with software, and I had a chief scientist who I believe was Brian Snow.
Yeah.
I think we had on the show. He said something to the effect of, well, there's really no such thing as software in terms of what NSA does. It's all firmware, meaning it's all embedded, it's all impenetrable, tamper protected, in ways that I'm sure are replicated now in the public sector, but back then it was pretty secret. So maybe it's just a matter of me needing to update my definition of firmware and what everybody's understanding of firmware is. But to me, when I hear firmware, it's you can't tamper with it, you can't touch it. It's static, it's set.
Yeah,
you don't change it.
But and I think two terms have emerged, Jeff, and I agree. Like there's the firmware that you can't update. It's tamper-proof or hard-coded firmware, and then there's the updatable kind. And I think that really, in my assessment, there's two reasons why firmware largely today is updatable, and one, that's so we can push out fixes, because most people don't write code perfectly the first time, or even once they've tested it a bunch, it's still not perfect. The second reason is to be able to add new features, right? And have that ability to update that firmware. However, I think it's a great segue into the Netgear article. There was 89 different devices that had a vulnerability, but 49 of those were end of life, and they will not, even though it is updatable, they will not produce an update for that. And what do we do? Is there even
throw it away?
But right, two options, right? Seriously. I can go buy a new device, or but the thing is, like, some of these devices, as they put in the notes, like, okay, some are 2009, some are 2017. Like, how long do we expect these devices to last? If it is serving a special purpose like that, and we don't need any special features, and I still do want support, can I even go buy that support? Like, why?
Yeah.
Or are these just so cheap and throw away that, like, that doesn't make sense? Or is there a business case for Netgear to go, yeah, your device is into life. However, if you pay us, I guess you wouldn't really pay $5 or $10 a month for that, because after a couple of months, you could just go buy a brand new device and get more features, right?
Yeah. Well, this is where...
And Paul, if you're using one of these consumer devices in your environment for a special purpose, you've got bigger problems.
Your special purpose is it's your firewall router and Wi-Fi access point for your home.
What I like...
Which I guess really isn't a special, it's a multi-featured purpose at that point.
Yeah, but what if it's a device that's being used by a small retail merchant,
right?
That they just have one or maybe a couple locations. I mean, if they're subject to PCI, guess what? They need to
go replace them.
Now, this is where I like what the UK is doing with IoT, and I think it could apply to some of these consumer electronics. Is they're saying, look, if you're going to put a device on the market, you have to support it for X period of time. That at least gives you the consumer a buffer that says, look, at least I know I'm going to get security updates for 5 years. And then maybe after that, I have to throw the thing away. But those regulations don't exist anywhere in the U.S. You said 2017. We're in 2020. That's 3 years, right? That's
3 years when it was end of life 3 years ago, which means it probably had an 5 to 8 year service life. I mean, you're pushing 8 to 13 years on one of these devices, and Jeff, you're arguing about a small mom and pop shop that's got a couple of locations, then they spend $200 on one of these routers for 3 locations,
and that's a nice one.
You got 13 years out of it. It's time to replace it. You got your money's worth.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But Larry, you bring up a great point. What is the lifetime of a device before you have to upgrade? What we're talking about in this case, like, let's limit it to Wi-Fi routers of some, even if it's we were just talking before, like my firewall and my Wi-Fi access points are 2 separate devices, right? Like, how long will those, what's the lifespan of those on my network? Now, I also think that's the beauty of open source, is that I can choose the hardware, put the software on there, and I think I get a much more expanded life cycle. Also, I think there's an expanded life cycle by separating those, right? Your Wi-Fi infrastructure is, in fact, separate from your firewall router
That's because you're a
infrastructure.
geek and you can set it up and configure it and maintain it. But the normal lay consumer probably doesn't have
One
that
device.
skill set.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you think about what typical business amortization schedules look like, technology is 2 to 5 years, depending on that technology. Some of that technology gets classified as a fixed asset, maybe 30 years, but we've gotten better at that. The accountants have gotten better realizing that the technology has a 2 to 5 year lifespan.
Yeah.
What I think
let me-
would be a great service, though, for consumers, if you could somehow convince them this is greater value, is it's a subscription program, right? And rather than every month or every year, it's like, you know what? Every 2 years, where you send us, we'll send you a new one. You send us back your old one. We give you some support in making that cut over, or make it super easy to, make that switch. Maybe the configuration's pulled down from the cloud, and this problem essentially could go away.
We do
if
it with
had that service.
smartphones.
We do it with phones, right?
We do it with
Yeah.
smartphones today.
Do every two.
I was going to bring that up, the whole smartphones thing. I mean, this is a huge deal within the PCI world, because PCI has a requirement that you've got to keep your systems patched. And if there's a patch that comes out that addresses a critical security flaw, you're supposed to have it installed within 30 days. And somebody figured out a long time ago, well, if something's not being supported, there's no patches being issued.
Right.
Therefore, you really can't be using stuff that's end of life, end of support. I mean, Microsoft has been all over this for years, because so many point of sale systems, a cash register to the layperson, is running on a Windows platform. In my early days of being a QSA, sort of in the middle range, everybody was running on XP devices, and XP was going end of life, end of service, and they were all these retailers. I was working with a retailer that had thousands of locations across the country, so swapping out all of their point of sale systems was a huge effort. It's a big deal for PCI, keenly aware of it, and I'm interested in Matt, what the UK is trying to do. Microsoft came up with, okay, we'll still support the out of service stuff, the end of life stuff, but you're going to pay for the extra support. But even that comes to an end at some point, and Microsoft has been extremely generous in terms of how long they support.
Yeah, I don't know. So I spent a little more on my Ubiquity gear, a little more on actually Chinese knockoff firewalls that run pfSense. And I tell you what,
Oh, Tom.
I still get updates to pfSense. My original Wi-Fi access points I bought in 2007 I still get firmware updates from Ubiquity, and they weren't that much more than other similar access points. But the point is, I haven't had to go out and buy it to replace my hardware, right? So I feel like I'm ahead, because I haven't had to, one, go through the work of swapping out gear, which, as we all know, is a huge pain in the ass and causes downtime and all kinds of issues. I spent a little more, and I still get updates from the company, and we're talking about 13 years later. Right?
I think when you think about IoT for a second, in the lifespan of an IoT device that doesn't have, it's got embedded firmware, and it's a pretty somewhat dumb device.
I don't know. Firewalls and Wi-Fi access points are
different.
They're different. I mean, they are.
They are. Yes.
Technically IoT gear, right? But they're more infrastructure gear.
Correct.
We're talking about.
No, agree.
Right?
Look, hey guys, I don't have. I wanted to weigh in. I don't have a problem with companies declaring something end of life and aging them out of support.
I agree, Jeff. Right? I mean, if you write software, you don't want to support that from now to the end of time.
It becomes the long tail of support is, you've got to cut it off somewhere. What I have a problem with is putting a software device out on the market and not offering updates during its usable lifespan. That's where I have a problem.
And I think that's what the UK regulation was trying to address, Joff. Said, look, if you're going to put these devices in the consumer market, you have to identify what that period is, and that way consumers know, look, I'm at least going to get 3, 5, whatever year structure out of that, to your point, right? But if you don't state that up front, people are suckered into buying these things, and then maybe a year later or 2 years later, these devices aren't updated and end of life.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some fault to be had on all sides here. I think manufacturers that put out even infrastructure devices need to be very clear about that. Like the software on this device is going to be end of life at so and such a day. We will offer updates. It will automatically update according to our program, which not everybody offers, and they should. Within your control, and as long as they're very clear about exactly what's going to happen there, I think everybody would be better off, right? If it's like, okay, right, we know the deal,
I'm thinking that a lot of the home users, they buy a device like that, whether it's a computer or a router or whatever. I don't think they're thinking about, I'm going to need to replace it in 5 or 10 years. I think they're thinking they'll replace it when it dies, dead on the floor. And that's a culture change. They're not used to stuff going unsupported, or they don't care. I mean,
yeah, that's like an enterprise thing. I agree.
But that's something we've talked about before. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say most of the consumers, I think, are renting their or leasing their modems, right, from Comcast or whatever. That's probably
they're part of the service,
right? Yeah. Yeah, but that's even worse. I've leased a modem in the past that like they just weren't releasing updates for, and there was like there was an exploit for, and there was nothing I could do as a consumer. I just had to go and replace it,
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like Quest in Colorado, where I live, if I call them up for a technical ticket, they're like, yeah, your modem's really out of date. They'll actually send me a new one, and I'll swap it out. Now I'm on gig fiber, so I've got the latest and greatest tech. They've done a pretty good job at that level. But then, as we were talking about earlier today, Paul and I, I've got a D-Link router, D-Link access point that's also serving up my Wi-Fi and everything else. That's not the same scenario with my D-Link. So I am getting some of that support at kind of the modem router level from the providers, but my other gear that I put in the house, I don't necessarily have that same capability.
And you got a lot of great backdoors and vulnerabilities in your D-Link gear too.
Of course.
Gotta get the ubiquity.
Yeah, I think you're right. Ubiquity's done a great job of that too, and I think one of also the best pieces of advice, Larry, came from you, and you were like, dude, you can call up Verizon and you can get an Ethernet handoff, right?
Yep.
Like whatever device it is that is terminating the fiber or coax, that's giving me the Ethernet handoff, like that's I don't even know if it carries the internet, the IP address, like that's internal, like that's their thing.
Yep.
I just want the Ethernet handoff, and I'll take care of everything else after that. That's to me more of the model.
That's again not what the average consumer is going to do,
right?
But that's certainly what you and I would do, and that's exactly what I asked. I'm looking up on the sky here because I'm looking up my device that's on the wall. It's just a fiber bridge. They give me an Ethernet handoff, and I insisted on that after, frankly, that crap went tits up, and I was just like, okay, just give me an Ethernet handoff because I could do this crap. Right, but that everybody else is not going to be in that same boat.
I mean, I think that certain ISPs could and consumers benefit from having the ISP kind of manage that. Be like, look, yes, we've got the technology to give you an Ethernet handoff, but if you don't want to manage the device on the other end of that, the ISP should give them a device and go, you know what, we're just going to be really diligent about upgrading that. The problem is they're not. And they're only doing it, like Matt, like what you said, when you call them up with a problem, and they're like, oh, yeah, we need to come swap out your device. I think there's an economic incentive for them to put you on a plan where, like, every year it's X amount of cost, and guess what? We'll, come out and swap those devices out for you, make sure everything works every single year to get the latest technology and updates.
Yeah.
If you need that. I mean, you could make what the amazing part about Ubiquity is you can buy that gear. And like I said, it was like, I swear, 13 years ago, I think it's 2007, I bought my first Ubiquity access points. And they're still supporting the firmware update. I was actually totally expecting them at some point to be like, yeah, no, like you got to replace them, and that'd be totally cool because I've got more than my money's worth out of them. And they're just, 2.4 gigahertz. They're not even air. They're just BG access points. They still work great, and they're still totally fine. But that's great engineering also from Ubiquiti, definitely.
You know, Lee touched on this, and it's because we're older probably, but I know we've talked about this on the show before where, you know, I think it's reasonable that companies have an expectation that when they invest in technology, they ought to be able to use it for a long time. And you know, I remember when I was a kid, I was using, you know, kitchen appliances and stuff like that, you know, my parents had for 10, 15, 20 years and you know, stoves and ovens and dishwashers and stuff like that. You know, they just lasted a long time. I don't know who it was, but, you know, and I think a lot of it has to do with the cell phones and mobile technology, but, you know, somehow we got the society to shift modes into thinking, well, we got to refresh our technology every 12 to 18 months. And we expect it. And, you know, you're talking about getting a lot of good use out of it, but I'm thinking you got a couple years, whereas older generations, you know, we're used to things lasting 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, I know we've talked about, like, you know, 4690s that are still kicking, mainframes that are still kicking. Why replace them when they're doing all the work?
Wait, 4690 point of sale gear from IBM?
Well, I'm not saying that they're not out there today, but, you know, I saw them in my day.
And let's hope that my code that I wrote for 4690s in the late 90s is still not running today, because I did work on that platform.
I bring the 4690s up because I think we mentioned that in whatever episode we talked about this.
There's probably very few people listening that actually know.
Yeah, but
about that,
I was supporting PDP-11s well past their time.
Yes.
VAX 11 780s way past their time. Look, some of these, like industrial control systems, you put these systems in place. Dude, these things are in plants like 15, 20, 30 years, right?
Right.
I mean, you have to realize that. I mean, I was replacing gear in the nuclear power plants that were, they were older than I was at the time. This was in the late 90s. I mean, I replaced them with, like, the new shiny VAX Alphas. I guarantee you those damn systems are still sitting there, and it's been almost 30 years since I put those systems in.
Well, but to give you an example from the military, you know, battleships have been retired at this point. We don't use battleships anymore. But when I was, you know, they were used into the 80s and 90s. And I think Steven Seagal, in one of his movies, retired the last battleship. That's trivia for you.
It was a great board game.
It was, but I mean the 16-inch guns on a battleship, and there was 3 sets of 3 guns, so there's 9 guns total. I used to work for the Navy before NSA.
And you're good at math.
I try to be. The technology that fired these 16-inch guns, you know, where the shells were like 200 pounds, and, you know, they're 16 inches wide, obviously. That's why you call it a 16-inch gun, and they're about 3 feet long. The mechanisms that fired these guns that were used on battleships into the 80s-ish, early 90s, was designed in the 30s and largely didn't change. They changed what they were shooting, but the guns themselves didn't change. 50, 60-year-old technology, it worked. They didn't change it. They didn't update it. That's what a generation ago is used to.
Mm-hmm. We can all hope after 50 or 60 years our guns still work.
Yeah, and can you convert the inches into gauges for me? Can you work on that math? It'd be like a negative number, wouldn't it?
I have no idea. I'm not a gun person. Just
can I just vote for the next story?
Yes. Thank you, Job.
Let's do it.
Thank you, Job. We beat that horse to death. Let's go on.
You want me to actually name the next story? Okay.
No. Yes. So hold on. Yes. I have an interesting one. Trump says he's going to ban the popular Chinese video app TikTok.
TikTok. Yes.
My friends and family have been talking about this, and I'm like, look. I don't understand. Like, I truly don't understand how the U.S. government can say, they can say it, but enforce this, that we're going to ban this particular software, which complies, conceivably.
Yeah.
It was what I understood. Like, if it didn't comply with the Apple and Google guidelines for publishing an app, they would have already removed it. It complies with their guidelines and standards.
Yeah.
Is it even feasible? I mean, I guess the government...
But Doug and I talked about this on Monday.
Can the government just ban anything
here's what I
don't understand how
No. Here's what I think the government can do. Mm-hmm. The government can say, look, federal employees cannot use TikTok.
But that's not what they're talking about.
No, I know.
They've already done that. They've already done that. They've already said military government use of TikTok has been. They did that last year.
Yeah, but there's certain things that I think an executive order can and can't do, right? So an executive order can say, look, we're not going to allow this on government devices. Okay, already done, got it. How do you enforce it beyond that? That's where I think the challenges and the legal challenges come in. You can't.
That's what this article is saying.
Yeah, but this is interesting. I mean, Doug and I walked through aspects of this on Monday in a segment on a micro interview. Is that, look, you'd have to go to Google and Apple and pull it out of the store. What's the legal rights for the federal government to say I can ban this? And I think Trump realized, wait, I don't know if I can go that far. So he said, I'm going to put a 45-day moratorium on this and see if Microsoft buys it and brings it into the U.S. Then I don't have jurisdiction and I can wipe my hands of this. Well, then I saw yesterday, I think it was, Apple said, well, we're interested in TikTok too. So now what you're going to have is this really interesting bidding war between Microsoft and Apple potentially on bringing TikTok to the U.S. And then the question becomes, does the president have the legal rights to put a ban in place for something that's now owned by America? I don't think he does. Personally, I think the court challenges would be crazy.
This article made it sound like that, So Microsoft has reported been in talks to buy the app from ByteDance, but President Trump appeared to cast doubt that such a deal would be allowed through.
Right.
So they're trying to block
they're trying to do it from
they can block that.
From an antitrust perspective.
Correct.
They can block it. But then Trump's
also commerce rules.
Right.
But they have to prove that in court.
Yeah,
right?
but Trump said, look, I'm going to put a 45-day moratorium on this ban and see where this goes with Microsoft. And then Apple jumped into the ring yesterday and said, well, we're interested. So I think this gets interesting. And what Trump said is, look, if in 45 days this hasn't reconciled itself and I'm still concerned, I'm going to put a ban in place. But now you're going to have a bunch of court fights, I think, because how do you ban an application? Do you call it on national security?
But you
I don't know.
can't do that via executive order. That has to be a bill that has to go through
Not necessarily.
Congress.
No. This is where the executive orders from the president have some really interesting nuances in them. Certain things can be, typically you would run things through Congress and Senate and make it a law. But there is an executive order privilege for the president under certain circumstances. You're going to have to prove...
like threat to national security is what they're saying.
Which is what he's going to have to do in order to enforce a ban. Say, look, I think there's national security interests here in intellectual property theft or privacy theft or something like that where I could ban it. But then the enforcement mechanism, that gets really, really difficult because now you've got to go to all these Play stores that have TikTok and other things to get them to pull it out. Look, he's not winning the battle on the social media side. He's not. I mean...
but the government in general, regardless of who is in office or not, has traditionally lost against Apple that's like, well, you need to unlock this phone. And Apple's like, no.
Right. From a privacy concern. Now, you can pull a national security card and potentially get something moving, but I'm going to tell you right now, there's going to be a ton of court battles here. In order to enforce it, it's going to go through courts, it's going to go through appellate courts, it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and whether he has the authority to make that ban. That's where things get really, really dicey in an executive order like this. And so I think it's going to be hard to enforce, even if he tries to pull a national security card. Personally, right?
Right.
So I have a question. All this political banter is great, but has anybody actually taken the app and done a static analysis on it? Because I know some people that have.
And what's the results?
So, Joff, there was an article, and we didn't get to see all of the researchers' results. We saw their results, right, of their analysis, but we didn't get to see the process and the evidence that in the data that led them to those results. And that's largely what many were working off of. I think, Jeff, you and I are falling in the same camp here to be like, okay, but who's actually done the analysis and will not just talk about the results, but talk about the process and provide evidence so that we can all scrutinize their data and draw our own conclusions and agree or disagree with their results. Jeff, I think this very much speaks to also, crypto algorithms, right? And putting it out there and saying, this is how it works, and it's out there for public review. I don't think we've seen that for TikTok.
So we'll see some stuff.
I know, some researchers on your team, right, are working on that.
Yeah, so I'm speaking, Derek's done a little bit of work on this, one of the guys at Black Hills. In fact, I was reviewing his blog entry just today, and it is some static analysis on TikTok. Now, one thing I want to say about that was, this was Android focused, and the blog will be coming out. I'm the one that's doing the editorial review on it, so I got to get it done.
You're the holdup.
But
you are the weakest link.
It has got, I can tell you from reading today, it has got a massive attack surface. It is a giant application. It's got many exported receivers, providers. It's got 16 exported activities, 22 exported services, for example. These are all intent-driven in the Android platform and a subject. Basically, think of them as interfaces that can be potentially exploited for input. And not only that, TikTok on the Android actually is incredibly greedy in terms of the permissions that it asks for.
Right.
There was over 100 permissions that were declared in the manifest here, if I remember correctly here, reading, which is just stunning to me. You can probably see me flipping back and forth because of the light on the screen. It's really stunning just how massive the app is and how much of an attack surface there is. So even if they are not exfiltrating data and selling it to a government, I would not be surprised if there is some sort of vulnerability in this app, certainly on the Android side, just because of the size of the attack surface.
It breeds so much less confidence in the scrutiny that Apple and Google have for apps in the store. And I would really beg them to make improvements to that process so that basically you can't hack around the process. It sounds like that's what many apps do, TikTok included being the shining example.
But it's not only that. I think, Joff, you said something, sell to. They don't even have to sell to. They are legally obligated to give that information to the Chinese government because they're a Chinese-owned entity. And in China, it requires you to give that information to the government. They don't even have to sell it. They're just going to funnel it directly to the Chinese. And that's where the national security component that he'll probably pull,
it almost sounds like
in the executive order.
Export laws in reverse needs to be the issue, not just this one app. I guess that's where I'm having an issue. It's just like one app. Like we had export laws in place for crypto technology, which you can debate that, right? But now it sounds like it's almost in reverse, that if the entity that is producing the app is in another country, is that the legislation that we push through, that these apps, regardless of what they do, whether they conform with the policies or not, if they are, but I guess they could set up a shell company somewhere else to get around that.
But Doug and I talked about this. Why single out TikTok? Because you could think about every Chinese app in the market store that also has the same national security threat to our privacy by funneling that data to the Chinese. And so the one concern I have is you're focusing on TikTok, but if you're going to do this from a national security perspective, why wouldn't you widen the umbrella to all Chinese-based companies and applications?
I just want to throw out a few tidbits from the manifest here. This app has the permission to create any network socket. It has the permission to access all network state, read external storage, write external storage, access the Wi-Fi state, access the camera, record audio, access the flashlight, has the ability to prevent the phone from going to sleep, has the ability to get all contact information, has the ability to access all geolocation, has the ability to it has the ability to do everything with your phone that you need.
Right, but the only thing you said in there
and funnel it all to the Chinese.
But the only thing you said in there that makes sense for an app like TikTok in terms of permissions are like basically access to your camera and your microphone so that you can record videos and put them on TikTok, right? Like if I were installing an app, that would be my expectation that, okay, I understand if I'm going to use this app to record video and audio, it needs access to my camera and microphone.
Everything
all of the
else?
other permissions, I'm like, yeah, like why would it need access to my contacts?
Only if it's collecting telemetry data to send to the Chinese.
Disallow, location, disallow.
This is the reason I pointed it out, because of any of the apps I've ever analyzed, even, and I've done some mobile app testing, I've never seen one with a list that long. And when I chatted with Derek about it, he hadn't either. He's like, this is a massive list.
But I'd love to see Apple and Google put restrictions around, like, once you cross a threshold of requesting so many permissions that you need to go through an extra process to get your app, produced. And there's a number, a percentage, or some formula that they calculate based on the type of permissions plus the number of permissions. Like, once you cross a certain threshold, there's some extra things that you need to do.
You got to flag that thing.
You got to flag that thing.
Oh, yeah.
Who's to say? So who's to say that there's not additional code in there somewhere that allows them to upload further functionality? Because with that much access granted, with that much access granted, then the app basically has free reign over the entire phone.
It's a dropper. I mean, it's basically a dropper at that point.
Yep.
Right. And who's going to think to say no?
I'm just saying I'm suspicious with the initial read, and so there you go.
I agree, and I think, look, to the point of, from a national security perspective, leaking a lot of that telemetry data that you just talked about, Joff, right, and handed it to the Chinese because you are legally obligated in China to do that, creates a national security potential issue. The problem is with the concept of this executive order is it's only focused on TikTok, and I think this potentially exists in a lot of other potential Chinese based applications, but we're not taking a
Why limit it to China, though? Is China our only
No, it's not. It should be China, Iran, Korea.
Do you have the bottle opener over there?
I do, sorry.
And also, I want to transit. There's two stories that Larry and I had in common, largely because I want to get Larry's take, everyone's take, especially Larry, Joff, and others on the coal fire pen testers, because this was at this year's Black Hat conference. We've been covering it all week. I got a chance to virtually, and it's a shame. I wish I could have sat in person with both of the pen testers that were part of this story. Gary DeMercurio and Justin Wynn. I got a chance to meet them and do a whole segment with them. These were the two pen testers that worked for Coal Fire that were arrested on September 11th, 2019, and part of that story that we covered. Larry, I want to turn to you first about your kind of thoughts on this story as we get a lot, I think, more details about it.
Yeah. So for me, I think the big takeaways there were some of the things we'd already heard about the story, but reading through the story from their perspective and reading this article specifically, it was really disappointing to find out how quickly politics got involved in this testing. In that initially the local officers were fine, everything was cool, and then the sheriff showed up.
Right. That was the most disappointing
part. We have jurisdiction here, and nobody told us.
But Larry,
that was the most disappointing part to me was when I talked with Gary and Justin, and I'm like, so I don't want to spoil your talk, but like, tell me how it went down. And they were like, dude, look, we're doing a pen test, got into the building, tripped an alarm, police were called, and like, they were like, we showed our permission slip. And the local police were like, yeah, it's cool. And they were Gary and Justin, they're one of us, right? And they're super nice people. And they were like, Paul, we're basically like shooting the shit with them, right? Like any of us would do, right? Talking with law enforcement, we all have worked. I believe every single one of us have worked with law enforcement at some juncture in our careers, right? And you sit there and you share information and you tell stories and you talk about what you do. You try and help them and give them tips. And they were doing just that, something that I believe every single one of us have done in our careers. And in that time period is what allowed the ridiculous, stupid bullshit stuff to unfold. Yeah, that was the most disheartening part of the story. I agree, Larry. Yeah.
Because they said in the interview that we did this week with them in Virtual Hacker Summer Camp was, look, we had the get out of jail free card. We could have pulled it and left, and we would have been fine.
Right.
We would have been fine.
We were being nice, talking with law enforcement.
We were talking to law enforcement, and then the county came in. And this is the jurisdiction stuff. And we talked about this when the story broke, and I was on that show, and I remember this. It was the jurisdiction between the state, the city, the county, the whole 9 yards. And what was interesting to me in the conversation you had with them, Paul, was, look, the state was occupying the building, but it was owned by the county.
Yeah.
And this was a jurisdictional issue, is that the county's like, we own the building, we're giving it to you at the state level. They had all their get out of jail free cards from the state, but then the county played this, but we own the building thing. And that was the crazy aspects of this whole story.
Yeah, and the other one that I pulled out,
but not really that crazy. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Larry. I'll wait.
So the other one that I pulled out of it too was that during the process of them going to their hearings and all this type of stuff, that basically the state did, whatever, not our problem. Sorry, guys. We didn't hire you to pen test this stuff, or they just chose to be silent. And eventually they were forced to admit in court that yes, they had contracted and that they had given them permission to do so. Which also was really crappy that the state did that.
Yeah, it is. It is. I kept going. What kept going through my mind throughout the whole thing was this could be any one of us.
Yep.
We've all.
Oh man.
Absolutely.
We've all done this sort of work.
Absolutely.
We all have legitimate concerns about it. But we've done it, and in good faith, we've all followed the proper procedures to make sure that everybody that should be in the know is in the know, and everything I read about the Coalfire story says they did exactly that same thing. So it was stunning that basically a turf war, and they got caught in the middle of a turf war.
That body cam footage was pretty damning too.
Yes,
it was very clear that it was someone got butthurt that they didn't get a call.
Yep, exactly right.
Yep,
Jeffrey,
exactly. Jeff.
So, did I ever tell you about the time I had a cert advisory issued against me?
Yes, Jeff, you actually describe a similar incident in your interviews when you talk about your time at the agency, right?
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say behind bars for a second there.
No, I do. I've had, let me caveat this with when I was doing the pen testing. There was very little law
precedence,
on the books or legal precedent. So I think I benefited from
the lack of.
What law did you actually break? You didn't, so okay, we'll let you go. My first thought about all this is, of course it's political. Their customer was the government.
Yep.
It was state level, but how do you not be political? And I've worked for the government. I know how political government can be. That's why I don't work for the government anymore. So, were they going to get the case dismissed at the end of the day? I didn't have any problem thinking that was going to happen eventually. So 2 stories. First one is, and this was post NSA. This is when I was working in the private sector, but initially out of NSA, I was working for a government contractor. We were trying to spin up a commercial practice, but we also had the government contractor, and I was doing a penetration test of a an Army facility that happened to be hosted on an Air Force base. I won't give you the details. And we went through all the notifications and getting the get out of jail free card and making sure that there was we had the right people to call in case there was a problem, all of that. And back in those days, we weren't doing anything stealthy. We would light things up like a Christmas tree because nobody was watching. It didn't matter. The Army, the Army, being a branch of the military, they have their chain of command, and you have to, it's political, but with a twist. So they notified all their chain of command all the way up the tree. We did a bunch of work one night. We woke up the next morning and we had this panicked email or phone call, I forget which, from our customer saying, apparently there's been a cert advisory issued against you guys. And we're like, well, that's interesting. As it turned out, similar somewhat to this story is, although we were on dealing with the Army and we'd notified all the Army, somebody forgot to think about the fact that the Army, the target that we were going after, was a tenant on an Air Force base. And guess who owned the internet at some level?
Somewhere else, the internet
the network,
the Air Force, right? Yeah.
It was the Air Force, and it was an Air Force cert advisory. I've been trying to find it. I've been looking through the archives for a while now. I would love to just have the cert advisory that was issued against me. It's got to exist somewhere. But so that's the one story. I also, one of the members of the pit, who I will not name, he's a very private person. I will not ever reveal his identity.
So not Ron Gula.
Not Ron Gula, but Ron certainly knows him and knows this story. And again, it was post NSA. He actually worked for a company that was 2 doors down from me in an office park in Columbia, Maryland. So we kept in touch. He was, again, doing work for the government. He was working for a company that was doing government contracting and still doing some work. And he was doing some forensics investigations of a particular customer that had a compromise, a breach. And in his forensics research, he came across some credentials for an FTP server. And back in those days, FTP servers were very often were very soft targets and were very commonly used we called them wares servers. You drop your exploits, you drop your rootkits and all that.
Been there.
And he found credentials for it, and he thought, I'm going to log on to that FTP server see if I can find any clues. Well, it turned his customer, who he was doing this work for, was the FBI. He got a knock on the door, 6 a.m. one morning, suits, warrants, met him at the door, and they came in and confiscated all of his computers, everything in his home. He was working from home, and they confiscated everything. Turns out another part of the FBI was also aware of this FTP server that had been used as a ware server and was monitoring it. And when they saw somebody logging in with the credentials, they thought that they got the guy.
Right.
And, so very understandable, not a big deal. It was painful for this guy because he was such a private person, and he had, all of his personal and professional work, computers, technology, everything was taken from him and confiscated. And it was very relatively quickly discovered that the FBI had caught the bad guy and they were ready to prosecute him, but the FBI was the customer and he had all the right.
Yeah. That's amazing that it's in the same agency within the government, Jeff. Right?
It was within the same agency.
So amazing.
But I swear to God, it took him over 2 years. I want to say even back. 3 years to get all of his stuff back, because it was such a political nightmare that, the FBI didn't want to admit that the FBI had made a mistake. The FBI didn't want to admit that they didn't know what they were doing. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. So it was an internal political snafu.
Firestorm.
that he was just sort of the victim of, and he had to suffer the consequences of. So I have these stories in my background. The coal fire thing doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, part of me thinks, well, shit, if you're a pen tester and you've never been arrested or almost almost been prosecuted, you're not doing your job.
True.
But maybe that's if you're not a good pen tester. If you're a good pen tester, you don't get.
What Gary and Justin are advocating for is the Good Samaritan law, right? Mm-hmm. And they related this to an aspect of the story that we hadn't really talked about, and that is first responders, right? And EMS EMS and firefighters and even police officers, right? That they're responding to an incident as part of their job, right, or accessing a facility as part of their job, much like pen testers do. Gary and Justin were accessing this facility to show the flaws so that everyone who lives in the county and works for the county, the government in the state can be more secure, right? That was their goal. Same thing with first responders that are trying to help people, right, would have that same level of access. And I think there are some exceptions that we make for first responders. Like, we're not going to, do we charge EMTs with trespassing and or breaking and entering when they're going in to save someone's life, right?
Or do we do we prosecute somebody for trying to save somebody with CPR on the sidewalk when they're trying to do good, but the guy dies, right?
Right.
I mean, similar scenarios, right?
Good Samaritan law is what they're advocating for, and they're asking. Well, the ask from the interview in their talk is help from the community to help push this forward, so that those of us that are doing good don't suffer consequences like Gary and Justin have suffered.
Well, I'll say this. I think what happened to them is a one-off. It's an anomaly. It doesn't happen very often, and it all worked out in the end. So I don't know if it's necessary to go that route.
Yeah, but they touched
though.
on this.
Yeah.
I listened to that interview all the way through. Look, Coal Fire's executive team, the CIO, and the organization said, "Look, we're here to support you." They posted bond. They were supportive all the way.
$100,000,
right? And not
because they were a flight risk.
Correct. Because they
according to the state.
Yeah, because they weren't there. They weren't legally living there. They were living somewhere else. Coal Fire is based in Colorado, for example, right? I know the Coal Fire folks, right? And so one was they had the corporate support of a large organization like Coal Fire to support them to get bail.
They said it. They're like, if this was a smaller company and someone had to come up with basically $100,000 cash.
Right. How many smaller pen test firms could actually post bond to get their guys out of jail? That was number 1.
20 hours becomes months in prison.
I thought it was just a phenomenal story that you really extracted out of them. And to say, look, this could happen to anybody. And if you're a smaller pen test firm, do you have that kind of funds to do that? Coal Fire's executive team was there all the way through this and said, we're going to post bond, we're going to get you through this, etc. That was number 1. And so not everybody can do that. And so that was one piece on this Good Samaritan law. The second one that came out of that interview was some funds available to make available to other pen testing firms and pen testers that if they ever fell into the situation, how do they help them get out of the situation? Those were the 2 takeaways I took out of that
the third
interview.
one is, let's be frank, we can try to affect change here in the U.S. and be a lot more successful than affecting change in other countries. What happens when you are contracted to do this type of work in another country? Do we not do that now? Do we not work to help protect other countries? I mean, let's be frank, we're all people. We all want the same level of protection, whether you live in the U.S. or some other country.
Right.
It doesn't matter, right?
I fly to the UK and I do a pen test because my company's based in the US and the UK. How am I going to get protections in the UK if I go over and do a pen test and I get arrested?
And that's even easier than where all the different countries in the world fall as to how the relationships are between that country and the US. And that's scary. That's scary.
And that's what they were trying to get across.
And some of the other things you think about is that these guys will now have, quote, on their permanent record,
felony arrests.
Felony arrests, not felony convictions, but felony arrests. And that's not a good thing. Think about if you'd gotten a felony arrest and had been dealing with this stuff for months, and you were not a naturalized citizen, but you were here on a green card and available for working.
Right. Well, and the good thing for Gary and Justin, and this is why I think we need to evangelize this, is that if Gary and Justin do want to go get jobs elsewhere, it's important that everyone knows what happened, right? So that they're not limited in any capacity,
right?
To acquiring work if they choose to leave coal-fired.
Well, exactly. Especially if they leave the pen testing industry. What if they go off and they want to do something else, and somebody outside of our industry looks at it and goes, "No, you got a felony arrest. I'm not hiring you."
Right. It's a great point, Joe. That's a great point.
I mean, you think about the privacy laws overseas, but I mean, you also think about what that potential impact of that arrest record is on your livelihood, whether you're in the industry or not in the industry. You don't want that to be this thing that prevents you from getting the next job. That's just a horrible scenario.
And that's Larry? Because the sheriff wanted to come in and swing his
that's pretty much what it was.
Swing his authority around.
Yeah. Larry, there was another article on hacking satellites, and I know this is not the first time we've seen research on this, and it seems like the narrative in much of it is the same. Did you notice any differences between previous research that has been published on the topic of satellite hacking versus this? And I know this is an area very much in your wheelhouse.
And I covered this on a microsegment too.
And exactly. And I think one of the things that we need to clarify is it wasn't so much that they were hacking the satellites themselves, is that there was receipt of communication of the satellite communication. And then the decoding and so forth of those. I didn't get very far into the talk. I did read the article. I started watching the talk this afternoon and ran out of time. But the initial stuff that was disclosed in the talk that was discovered since some of the previous ones became more and more terrifying. In that the types of data, Excel spreadsheets with really sensitive proprietary information, the transmission of flight and weather data to an aircraft on the same connection that was being used for in-flight entertainment, the ability to reconfigure and update windmills, and this was just in like the first 5 minutes of the presentation that I saw. Like, to me, the amount of data and the types of data is becoming scarier that we're starting to see with these systems.
I actually did a micro interview with him on Virtual Hacker Summer Camp, and what I thought was interesting is that he's using basic home-based TV capabilities to intercept this communication over the airways, because there is a break in the encryption algorithms from the satellite down that allows you to intercept that data. And we talk through various scenarios, airplanes, maritime, etc., where satellite communications, Larry, are used, but it's in an unencrypted format. It is a lack of these satellite providers providing full end-to-end encryption in this particular case.
Because they need to update their firmware.
Yeah.
And what happens if you break a satellite? You can't just go plug a USB device into it, right?
The other interesting data point there is the equipment he purchased was worth about $300.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's my point.
Yeah.
I mean, because I asked him on the interview, I'm like, you're just using TV-based stuff. He says, yeah, because it's all the same communication. What has happened with satellite internet communication is adding on capabilities to our normal TV communications and broadcast signals in the satellites. We've added these capabilities on, but there are gaps in the protections when it comes down from the satellite back down, and it creates this huge cone over the area to make sure that you can get that signal. And so it creates this really expansive attack surface that I can now potentially intercept with basic TV technologies to intercept that communication, and it applies to so many different industries. We were talking through airplane stuff, and I'm like, I don't use a lot of airplane Wi-Fi. I'm doing stuff offline. I don't necessarily connect to the Wi-Fi.
I was going to say this attack is analogous to using an open Wi-Fi access point is what we're saying.
Right.
Which means, if you've got a TLS encrypted communication across that channel, you're probably going to be okay. With the exception of the stuff that's going in the clear, which is the beginning of the transaction, right? The negotiation and for the cipher strength and the client server hello stuff. So it is scary because there's no underlying layer of encryption, right? I mean, what I'm reading here is it's just like open Wi-Fi, which which is considerably dangerous. And you've got to think, Larry. I know your head's going here. There's got to be man-in-the-middle potential here. Has to be.
Absolutely. We actually talked about the potential man-in-the-middle attacks because now you have these surface-based interceptors that are trying to take that communication and broadcast it back out. And where is that intercept? And now you can play man-in-the-middle potential attacks on this to snoop that traffic. And that was part of the conversation I had with him a couple days ago.
Yeah,
I did want to transition to a couple more stories. In Joff, some of these are specific. I want to kind of not pick on you, but pick your brain. Prototype pollution. I think more common in JavaScript than other languages. Python is still vulnerable to prototype pollution, from what I understand as well. And that is, I pulled a definition that was linked to some presentations about prototype pollution from the article, and that is a term that was coined years ago in JavaScript to designate libraries that added extension methods to prototype base objects like object string or function. This really, in any object-oriented based language, is an attack vector, correct?
Sure. I mean, Python, any language that, back it out a little bit, any language that allows you to rewire and rewrite pieces of the interpreter or compiler of that language, which Python does, is going to be vulnerable to this. You can change the base objects, then you can extend them in any which way that you want to, which is, as I understand it, the definition of prototype pollution. And in fact, it's funny to me at some level because I've seen this in class. I'm actually going to teach next week, so I'm going to see this again, where students will accidentally redefine some base types and then not understand why they broke the interpreter. And as the instructor, you come up to this and go, well, that's not working right. You got to exit out of that interpreter. Something's wrong. And they've done things like, said something like int equals float or something like that. And now the int function is now the float function. It's like, what?
Right. That would be bad. That introduced some heinous bugs.
It introduces heinous stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so any language that builds upon its own core keywords in this fashion is going to be subject to this sort of thing because, Python's even uses its own dictionary structure to store data structures about itself, right? It's very inward-looking that way. You can redefine everything in Python if you so choose to do so. So absolutely, this is a
couple of comments about Python. The data structures in Python are absolutely fascinating to me, and I think a really amazing feat of engineering. I think as a programmer, it's just a constant learning and relearning process on how to really exercise the data structures in Python. I feel like I could never stop learning about how to use Python data structures even better than I did before, right? I went back to code I wrote a year ago, and I was like, wow, I really didn't even understand fundamentals about Python data structures. Let me go rewrite that, right? But I feel like that's never done, right?
Yeah, no, see, so the ability to do things like, embed lists and dictionaries and dictionaries of lists and have dictionaries of dictionaries and do those sorts of things allow you to really extend your code into interesting spaces. And a lot of frankly, a lot of modern bytecode-oriented languages allow you to do the same thing. I'm pretty good with C# as well.
Sure.
And there's all of these different hashable types in there, and high-level objects for data structures that are very flexible and extendable. It's an amazing feature of the language. It gives you. Some people say after they've learned Python, after they've been in the class for a week, that it makes them into a lazier programmer because they've got such high-level power that's given to them that they're like, oh, well, that was easy, right?
Right.
And then it becomes a game of how short can my code get to actually achieve
I didn't need
goal.
3 separate data structures. I can just put them all in one, and it's great. It's a lot less code, and then I can use Lambda. It's great. But my other question...
I've always assumed that's why Python's so popular amongst you guys.
No, yeah, it's a great point, Jeff. My other question, Jeff, is Python 2 to Python 3. Multi-part question. What are the security benefits going from Python 2 to Python 3? And I forgot my second part.
What are the ramifications of going from 2 to 3?
There are ramifications from going to 2 to 3. But the first part is like, what are the security? Are there security benefits? And if so, what are they in the 2 to 3 conversion? Because I know you've done a webcast or two on this.
Yeah. So one of the things there's not. First of all, there's not a tremendous amount of security benefit that has changed in that transition. One of the big issues that Python 2 had, and still has, is the keyboard input function and its propensity to evaluate the statements and essentially give it a code injection flaw. That's a significant issue in Python 2. And Guido and the gang, thankfully did away with that in Python 3. Some of the major things that have happened, though, as we go from Python 2 to Python 3, has been a massive optimization of the way that we're using memory inside of the interpreter. In Python 2, there was a tremendous amount of emphasis on lists. It was one of these fundamental data structures in the interpreter, and many of the built-in functions would always produce lists, which tends to be a little bit memory intensive.
I see.
Over the lifetime of a program or whatever code you're writing. Python 3 introduced many generator objects as a result of some of the built-in functions instead of lists. And those generator objects are much more efficient in terms of memory because they're essentially just pointers into data structures that you can then index with a loop. Instead of producing another allocated list in memory. So,
Jeff, what version of Python 3, that was my second part of my question, should we be striving for today?
That's a tough one. That one is really intermixed with virtualization and Dockerization of applications.
Like with Docker, I get to choose, right? And I can easily switch between what version is it? And I'm about to make that leap and start and embark on that project, and I'm like, what version of 3 do I want to go to? Right? Is 3.8 the most recent stable version? Right? Because 3.9 is still is that in beta sort of?
3.9 I think is still early right now.
Okay.
If I recall correctly, 3.8 is stable release at 3. And when I'm Dockerizing applications, which I actually have been doing lately. I'll tend to go, with a cut down image, like Alpine, for example, and do a Python 3.8, a Python stable, and stick it there. Docker and Python go together really, really well because you can really get your versioning just right. And one of the things, unfortunately, that Python has suffered with over time has been the subtle change in modules and methods within modules that cause things to break in versioning.
Transient dependencies, Yep,
and I think every language basically suffers from that.
Agreed.
But the Dockerization, the application virtualization level stuff completely solves that problem in a platform-neutral way, which is a godsend. I mean, really is. I literally just wrote, in fact, I'm going to put in a plug here, Paul. I'm in the middle of writing a malware implant class that I'm going to start teaching for Black Hills later this year, and it's a C2 API, so command and control API that I've written that's completely Dockerized in Python, and I'm going to give it away for free. So as part of the class, part of the class enrollment, but I will publish it on a GitHub.
That's not free technically, Jeff, but go ahead.
Well, I will publish it openly as well, though. Okay.
Okay.
But this thing was so portable when I finished the base code that I picked the API up in a Docker container and I stuck it into a Windows platform and just ran it, and it 100% worked right out of the box. And this is some of the stuff that Docker gives you, right?
You know, kind of a nerdy thing about...
3.8's the answer,
But
Paul,
a nerdy thing about Docker and Python, and you mentioned Alpine, I would say you can choose your platform, and my approach has been to do a multi-stage Docker build that uses a Python virtual environment in the first stage and then just copies the result of that to the second stage. And then it doesn't matter what you're using, because what you built with, you leave behind in the first stage, and you can move to the second stage on whatever platform you want to run.
Yeah, so it depends on your goals, right? This particular one is a Python Flask API with Swagger as the API definition. So it was very self-contained in that respect. But that ability to actually encapsulate that into a nice version build in that DevOps sense, it's just huge. It really is huge.
Python 3.8, got it.
Yeah, 3.8.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Because we are Dockerized, right? In what we're
Flask.
doing. In Flask.
Flask is my wheelhouse.
And we want the portability. The question is, do we stay on a Debian Ubuntu build, or do we move to an Alpine, which is muzzle-based?
But it doesn't matter, because I build the Docker environment in the first stage. And so all of my Python library dependencies, all my Python code are in that first stage. I copy it to the second stage. All I need is the interpreter, and I don't need to. So the platform is really independent at that point. The reason I haven't gone Alpine is because the glibc, and I'm worried about dependencies.
glibc and muzzle, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's your difference, right?
Right.
I think it depends on your approach, and it also depends on your microarchitecture of your application that you're dealing with.
Jeff is jumping up and down over there. Sorry.
In my case, it was really nice to have it very, very small and self-contained in the Alpine image, and only add in the dependencies I wanted to keep it very tight.
Jeffrey.
I wanted to transition to a new story. You guys are talking API, and I kind of threw this up for giggles, but I am curious as to what you think about it. My story number 5. For DevOps, API is a major security vulnerability.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
It is.
It is. It has been. I had Chris Weisopel on. We have other sponsors that address aspects of APIs. When you think about an application, and Joff, I don't know how microservice-based you are, but as we look to expand our application into more microservice architectures, you've got a lot of API communication, right? And I think that's the one big area that is evolving with application security is how do you test those API endpoints and verify security around those, because that is the main communication mechanism between all these microservice architecture environments.
Yeah, look, I don't think it's any different than what we've done traditionally in the past, right? Take the principle of least privilege. Keep your API designs really well defined and tight. This is where
is it a principle, Jeff? Is it a principle, or is it more like an idea?
No, it's the same principles that we talk about, right? It's protecting your credentials, but it's protecting your credentials, right? In the truest sense of the word, to protect them from falling in the wrong hands, right? In your architecture, but also how you transmit those credentials, right? And that's a twofold issue. You see a lot of examples out there that are like, yeah, I can do authentication, but I'm not protecting them with any kind of encryption, or I'm protecting them with some kind of encrypted, transport layer, but then there's no authentication or authorization beyond that, and those are two separate issues. And these are all the things we run into with APIs, because essentially it's very similar to what a user would want to do to authenticate and have encryption and have authorization, except in the case of APIs, it's applications talking to each other.
Yeah.
And then you add on top of that the authentication, the authorization, then you need to think about what type of account is being used by the application to gain that data and what data they should have access to.
Right.
For example, we did a test at Guardians several years ago in which any authenticated user to the platform, which you could register for a free account, had access to the entire API, and it was had no restriction on the data you could ask for. You couldn't get another user's password, but you could get another user's order. And in fact, you could get another user's hashed credit card data, and then you could use that same hash to add it to your account.
Right. Well, it's the same thing with OAuth, right? We see that with social media networks, right, or Google, where I want this application to have a level of access to my account, and you see that list. Like, I want this whatever third party to have access to my Twitter account, and these are the things that it's allowed to do with that authorization that I've granted it, right?
I think also that another feature that's really important is really the architecture design aspect of things. If you're going to go into a world of using Docker containers and microservices for your application, then put it up on a whiteboard, draw it out, work out where the interfaces are of connecting each thing, and appropriately architect your risk into that design, right? Separate things out into containers that make sense with the appropriate authorization between them. That is architected such that. But you don't,
even better.
But that means you have a really good threat modeling program in place.
But a lot of the models that I've seen that I really like are building in like this broker kind of proxy layer. In that, all right, I got all these microservices, and they talk all over the place at different things. Like, let's let them make the request to a broker. Now you've got one place to go to say that, yes, this application needs this level of privilege. I control it in this one place, and it can access this, right? CyberArk has done a great job with their Conjure product of building that kind of architecture into their vault to say, it doesn't matter what the application's accessing. They send it to this tiny little process inside of the container that goes, hey, I got your request, and I'm going to go out to the vault.
I'm going to broker it
on your behalf. Amazon's API Gateway is a very similar concept where you're centralizing that access into one place. And I know it kind of sounds scary that in one place is where you're doing that, but I think the control that gives you is much better than trying to manage. I've got 25 different microservices and they only need to talk to each other, and I got to map out, like that whiteboard gets really full, I think, until you kind of centralize that into a central broker.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. In terms of, I think, somebody was also asking about what my thing's going to do. Well, I can tell you right now, my little OpenC2 API is tiny. And it is not going to be like enterprise quality software by any means.
It's what you do with it, Jeff.
It's what you do with it that matters.
You do with it, right?
Agreed.
And there is very little authentication. In fact, I will be perfectly honest right now and tell you there's an API key, and that's it. You can transmit that. Good luck.
Request broker architecture is not new.
No, it's
not new technology. But applied to microservices, I think.
I remember when we were at Qualys and we were building the RESTful API into the backend platform, and you authenticated, you got a key, you took that key, you put it into the next request. How do you protect that key, right? It's the same age-old problem, right?
The protection of the secrets is almost different from managing the RBAC of all your different microservices. Two totally separate things, right? You have to protect your secrets, but you also have to define the role-based access control across your entire application. Yeah. And again, a lot of this architecture in theory is not new. Like, role-based access control goes all the way back to mainframes, and request broker architecture, is something I was exposed to 20 plus years ago, right? You had the queuing services. IBM had the MQ series. Like none of that stuff is necessarily new. We just have to apply it to this new technology where we don't have those monolithic applications necessarily anymore. We've got now, instead of one monolithic application, we've got 20 or hundreds or thousands of applications.
Smaller.
And so it makes that broker architecture that much more important.
I think absolutely so, and you can't discount what the cloud providers are doing, right?
You can get that functionality from the cloud. Agreed.
But you also get some level of cloud lock-in, Joff, in that structure, right? And so if you're thinking about designing something that's portable to multiple architectures, you can't necessarily go all in with a single API broker solution either.
Well, it depends on your tolerance for future lock-in of technology, right?
Agreed. Yeah.
You look at the identity and account management that some folks like Amazon have implemented. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean,
super
there's
complex, but
fantastic
amazing.
level
Agreed.
of granularity there.
Yeah.
There's so much power that you can shoot yourself in your foot, leg, and your thigh 3 times over.
It's true.
But there's enough there. In fact, there's more than enough there to satisfy every need that you have, but you will be vertically locked into that provider, and so that's a design choice you have to make.
And many have
really every need, Jeff. Every need.
I don't know. AWS, Jeff, is pretty cool.
They're doing a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah,
I'm just telling you,
functionality
the functionality that Amazon puts out on a regular basis makes it really, really attractive to say, look, I'm all in with Amazon, and that's what they want.
Like price point is what we're talking about. Right, like they'll offer things like CloudFront 12 months for free, and that's just like your first hit. Not only just your first hit is free, but your first year's worth of hits are free. Then after that, you're gonna pay for it, and you can think about where you can push your application to in a year.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, well, we're just, going to use that unless you have a design that makes you portable, that you can piece off that functionality. And let's face it, it's going to be between Azure and GCP and AWS.
Yep.
But it all depends on the size and scope of your application. I think where we're at with our podcast automation software, we'd probably be fine going all in AWS, right?
But if you're not, that's where CyberArk and Conjure come into the equation to say, look, I can be this broker for you and give you functionality across the 3
But don't
platforms.
forget, we've got one application. Many large enterprises have hundreds or thousands of applications. So one of their apps might go great in AWS, but the next one might go, you know what? Architecturally, it makes sense for us to use AWS and GCP. And what's the solution that allows us to deploy an app in that configuration?
Yeah, there you go. Right, and not only that, it's not just the scale of the apps; it's also the scale of the users. There's some enterprises out there that have tens of thousands of users to these applications. They have to have an identity and access management solution that's flexible and granular. They have to. It's not an optional thing.
Right. It has to cross multiple clouds.
Yeah. And potentially multiple SaaS providers. I mean, you think about the hybridization of multi-cloud, multi-SaaS. That's where the Oktas and CyberArks and some of these other pings and SailPoints have potential benefits versus just locking yourself into an Amazon solution that locks you into
or an Azure
Amazon,
solution.
or an Azure solution or a GCP solution, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge.
Squeeze in one more.
There's a lot of good stuff out there.
Last story, Jeff.
Lee's
Smart
number
locks.
6 was requested.
Yeah, and it's also one of Paul's stories. That's the one where they were finding that there were smart locks that were transmitting enough information to download information about the location and the user and all that. They tried to clean it up, but they still allowed it to be vulnerable from or advertising a local MAC address that could be used to open it up. It was the UTech, I forget which model lock they had. It's about a $140 lock, and it was advertised as being very secure.
UltraLoq.
Yes. I mean, for a lock at that price point, I mean, that's high in the scale. Let's just put it that way in terms of my assessment of locks, whether that's a physical door lock or a padlock or whatever. In either case, that's an upper end of the scale. Us as security people would expect a much higher level of security other than The vulnerability being what the article states: hacker is able to sniff out the device's MAC address and help themselves to an access key based on the device's MAC address.
So
the one that I found particularly interesting about this one is it's one of the first times, we talk about hacking IoT, that I'd seen MQTT data involved in the hack. I'm still reading the article to figure out how exactly the MQTT stuff.
What is MQTT, Larry?
Figured in? It's a short messaging protocol.
Mm-hmm.
And quite honestly, ask me that same question in a couple of weeks because I need to become an expert on it in about that time frame.
Interesting.
And so he will become an expert on it.
Yes,
that's what we do as hackers, right? I think the quality of the hacker is we can become an expert, even pseudo expert, in a short period of time because we have to as part of our job.
Well, at least 5 of you can.
Well,
I'm excluding myself from that equation.
We try. That's just one of those things, right? We have to be flexible and be willing to pivot to new technologies, but it's that discovery process that's fun.
Yeah,
So,
no, I agree. And I think you have to look at it as fun and something that you like and want to do and go, what is that? I need to learn more about that. Let me come up to speed on it really quick.
I can tell you right now, you're not going to find me putting any, retail home store UltraLoqs on my house. Sorry. Not sorry.
Hey, I moved that we adjourn our session and pretend to go to Frankie's.
Oh,
I agree.
I'm with that.
I'm with that.
I'm with it too.
Thank you, everyone, for participating and listening to this edition of Paul Security Weekly. It's not over yet. We've got a pre-recorded interview coming up with Sumedh and Mehul from Qualys. Stay tuned. It's folks that have worked in vulnerability management for collectively a really long time. So make sure you stay tuned for that.